You can be sitting completely still and feel like you've just run a marathon. Your body isn't moving, but your mind is racing. Deadlines, messages, money, work, family, tomorrow. The conversation you wish had gone differently. And somehow, by the end of the day, you're exhausted even though you barely did anything physically demanding. So why can thinking about problems leave you feeling physically drained? The answer begins with something your brain does extremely well: prepare you for what might happen next. Imagine your brain as a security system. When it detects a threat, it doesn't wait for something terrible to happen. It prepares. Your heart can beat faster, your breathing can change. Your attention becomes more focused on what matters. Hormonal systems help mobilize energy. This response is extremely useful if you need to escape danger. But modern stress often doesn't work that way. Your threat might be an unanswered email, a difficult relationship, a financial problem, an exam next week. There may be nothing to run from, but your brain can still treat the situation as something requiring a response. And that's where the exhaustion begins to make sense. When your brain perceives a challenge, several systems coordinate to help you deal with it. One important pathway is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, often called the HPA axis. You don't need to remember the name. Think of it as part of your body's emergency coordination network. Your brain detects a demand, signals move through the system, and hormones, including cortisol, help coordinate the body's response. But cortisol isn't simply a bad stress hormone. You need cortisol. It follows a daily rhythm and plays important roles in metabolism, immune regulation, blood pressure, and helping the body respond to challenges. The problem isn't that your body responds to stress. The problem is that adaptation itself has a cost. Researchers sometimes describe this broader process using the concept of allostasis, the body's ability to change its internal state to meet changing demands. That's useful. Your body isn't designed to remain exactly the same all day. It adjusts. The trouble comes when demanding adjustments happen repeatedly, particularly when recovery is inadequate. This is where researchers use the term allostatic load to describe cumulative physiological dysregulation across multiple systems. And importantly, allostatic load isn't a single hormone or a diagnosis. It's a research framework involving multiple biological indicators. Scientists are still working toward more consistent ways of measuring it. So when someone says, "I'm completely exhausted from stress," there may be something real behind that experience. But the biology is much more complicated than simply having too much cortisol. Stress can also interfere with the very thing that helps you recover from stress: sleep. You're exhausted. You finally get into bed, and suddenly your brain starts reviewing everything. What if I forgot something? What happens tomorrow? Why did I say that? Your body is lying down. But your brain hasn't necessarily received the message that the day is over. Research suggests that poorer sleep can interact with stress response systems, and systematic reviews have found relationships between sleep disturbance and measures of physiological stress burden. So you can end up with a frustrating loop. Stress makes recovery harder. Poor recovery can make you more vulnerable to the effects of stress. And the next day begins with less capacity. Now you're tired, but you still have the same problems waiting for you. Not exactly. This is where popular explanations often go wrong. Your adrenal glands don't simply run out. Your body doesn't have one giant battery that stress drains until nothing remains. And cortisol isn't a simple gauge that tells us exactly how stressed you are. Human stress physiology is dynamic. Different people can respond differently to the same situation, and prolonged stress can involve changes across several systems rather than one predictable biological pattern. In fact, recent research on burnout biomarkers has found inconsistent physiological signatures rather than one reliable biological test. So the better mental model isn't "stress emptied my battery." It's "my body has been repeatedly adapting to demands, while recovery may not have kept pace." That's a much more useful way to think about exhaustion. First, stop treating every form of exhaustion as a motivation problem. If you're genuinely depleted, pushing harder isn't automatically the solution. Sometimes the missing ingredient is recovery. That doesn't mean spending an entire day doing nothing. It means identifying what keeps your nervous system and attention engaged long after the original demand has passed. One practical step is to create a transition between demanding work and rest. Finish the task. Write down what still needs to be done. Decide when you'll deal with it next. Then, step away. You're giving your brain a clear boundary instead of forcing it to keep holding unfinished tasks in working memory. Second, protect sleep. Not because sleep is a magical cure for stress, but because sleep is one of the major processes involved in physical and psychological recovery. If stress repeatedly disrupts your sleep, solving the stressor itself may matter more than simply trying harder to fall asleep. Third, reduce unnecessary demands where you can. This sounds obvious, but it's often overlooked. If every notification creates another tiny demand on your attention, turning some of them off isn't laziness. It's reducing the number of times your brain has to switch into response mode. And fourth, don't confuse self-care with avoidance. Exercise social connection. Relaxation and enjoyable activities can be useful parts of recovery. But if the source of stress is an unresolved problem, a toxic workload, persistent conflict, and financial pressure, or another serious issue, relaxation alone may not remove it. Sometimes recovery requires changing the environment that keeps producing the stress. Think back to that moment when you're sitting completely still, yet somehow feel exhausted. Maybe the better question isn't, why am I so tired when I haven't done anything? Maybe it's, how much has my brain and body been trying to manage today? Stress isn't imaginary simply because the threat isn't physical. Your brain doesn't need to see a lion for your body to prepare for a challenge, but that doesn't mean every stressful day is damaging you. The human stress response exists because adaptation is useful. The goal isn't to eliminate stress. That's impossible. The goal is to create enough recovery between demands that your body doesn't have to remain in adaptation mode indefinitely. Because sometimes exhaustion isn't your body telling you that you're weak. It's telling you that something has been demanding your attention, and your system hasn't had enough opportunity to reset. If you learned something, subscribe to Mindora for more fascinating insights into psychology, the brain, and human behavior, and if you have any question, ask in the comments section.